Shields and swords, feel the wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and placed, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. 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 Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
Probably the most famous non-fiction romantic couple of the Middle Ages are Heloise and Peter Abelard, who are the Eloisa and Abelard here in Alexander Pope's poem. And there are other fictional couples, Tristan and Isolde come to mind, who are probably more famous, but Peter Abelard and Heloise are really famous. And so I'm going to give you a really sort of stripped down version of their story. And even though there are some details I'm going to elide, you should keep in mind, like, Alexander Pope is really responding to the kind of the broader story, right? So little detailed differences aren't going to matter so much. Later researchers have come to say, well, maybe this was different, or maybe this should be contextualized a different way, but not for Alexander Pope. So basically in the 12th century, you have this guy, Peter Abelard, and he is a really famous philosopher and thinker. I think there's a good argument to be made that he's the most important male intellectual of his day in Europe. And he has a lot of enemies. He wanders around as a kind of peripatetic teacher, a kind of teacher who walks around and people come to where he is, or he'll go from one city to another teaching. And eventually he decides he wants to set up a school in Paris. So he goes to Paris. There are some complications here that I'm skipping over, but he ends up going to Paris. And while he's setting up there, there's an important man there whose name is Fulbert. And Fulbert, he offers to let him stay with him, free room and board, and all he has to do is tutor his niece, Heloise, or Eloisa here. Well, Abelard agrees to it. But as it turns out, Heloise is just a startling intellect, and she really sparks an interest, and they begin a secret romantic relationship. Well, what ultimately happens is she gets pregnant. Fulbert wants them to marry. Heloise does not want to marry him, not because she doesn't love him, but because she wants to be in real submission to him. It's an important thing for her. It's hard for people today to understand this because she is not just brilliant, but she is eventually becomes a pretty influential and powerful woman. But the one person that she wants to be in submission to is Peter Abelard. And she feels like if she marries him, he's bound to her. And if she doesn't marry him, he's not bound to her. And there's something more pure in their relationship, or more pure in their love. Abelard's willing to marry her. Heloise really resists. There's a lot of back and forth, which I'm not going to go into. And ultimately, there is a secret marriage, but it's supposed to be secret, but then Fulbert tells everyone. Well, Heloise denies it. She says, it's not true. We were never married. And so, ostensibly, in order to protect her from Fulbert, Abelard puts her in the Paraclete, in this monastery, where she will be as a nun for ultimately the rest of her life. But they don't know that at the time. Fulbert is really enraged, both that she would deny this and thus bring him to shame, and then also he thinks perhaps that Peter Abelard is trying to get rid of his wife by putting her away in the Paraclete, which is what it's called, the name of it, and you see it in the poem here. So Fulbert has a couple of his servants go in the middle of the night and pin down Peter Abelard and castrate him. And if you're thinking you didn't see that coming in the story, neither did Peter Abelard. It was shocking, and he was already famous, and this is super shocking what's happened here. The ultimate end story of this is the scandal really brought down Peter Abelard. Ironically, the same fame that made Heloise, the same scandal made Heloise famous, and ultimately, because of her great intellect, she ultimately became an influential and powerful person. So, some years later, Abelard decided to write about this. He wrote a book. The best translation is probably My Calamitous History. And he recounts these events. But one thing he says in it that really bothers Heloise is he says, well, I never really loved her. I was just using her. And so, it's probably for the best for me that this happened because I was deep in sin. And, although obviously I didn't want to be castrated, it was a real kind of wake-up call for me. Well, the thing that really makes Heloise mad is when he says that he didn't really love her. And so she writes a letter to him, secret letter to him, saying, listen, you liar, you know that you always loved me, so stop saying that you didn't. He writes back and says that he didn't. There's a little back and forth. And the truth is, no one outside their relationship can know. Actually, no one outside Peter Abelard can know. Scholars disagree on this. I think the scholarly consensus is that he did love her, but he found that it would be less painful for her if he said, no, I never loved you, that he maybe thought he was doing her some kind of favor. But there's no way of knowing really what he was thinking. And so there's a lot of back and forth, and several times in these secret letters, and several times she says, if you just say it, I will run away. I will abandon the church. I will abandon God. I will run away and be with you. Now, she's a very important nun, right? She's saying, I will abandon God. I'll abandon the church. I'll just run away and be with you. And he keeps writing saying, no, you shouldn't say that. That is bad. Don't say that. And there's a lot of back and forth. And she says, ultimately, he says, listen, if you keep saying this, I'm not going to write to you anymore. And she writes back and says, well, listen, I will not say this anymore, but you will know that by not saying it, I'm submitting to you. And so in a kind of jiu-jitsu, she turns her obedience in not talking about it in a kind of win for herself, that, see, you really do have power over me. It's interesting the way that she does this. And they continue to write back and forth for some time, for years, I guess, about intellectual matters, and she never raises it again. So he dies before her. He's older than she is by a decent bit. About 20 years later, she dies. And when she dies, these letters are found. And although there's a lot of scandalous, shocking stuff in it, people are really, people are really charmed by them. And so, although submission is an important part of her letter, and so ultimately they're buried together. So although submission is an important part of her letters, you see some of that in here, you definitely see some of that in here. A more important part of this poem that Alexander Pope has put together is the idea of memory. Memory is really essential here, and she says throughout it that the real torment is the memory, and that it would have been better not to have known him, not because she doesn't love him, not because she hates him, but rather the opposite, that she wants to repent of him, and then as soon as she thinks about him to repent of him, then she wants him again. We see this, for example, in lines 183 to 90, to 190. I ought to grieve, but cannot what I ought, to mourn the lover, not lament the fault. I view my crime, but to kindle at the view, repent old pleasures, solicit new. Now turn to heaven, I weep my past offense. Now I think of thee, and curse my innocence. Of all affliction taught a lover yet, 'tis sure the hardest science to forget. So she's basically saying, as soon as I start thinking, like, I want to be good, but all I can think about is you. As soon as I think about you, then I just want to run away with you. And this phrase, "to sure the hardest science to forget," is part of this idea of memory that we have throughout. We see later on, a little bit later in line, say 203 to 209, you get one of the more famous lines from here. O come, Oh, teach me nature to subdue. She's talking to him. Renounce my love, my life, myself, and you. She says, come and teach me to renounce you. Fill my fond heart with God alone, for he alone can rival, can succeed to thee. How happy is the blameless vessel's lot, the world forgetting, by the world forgot, eternal sunshine of the spotless mind. Here we have this idea that forgetting is what she needs. And this is a peculiar thing when you consider it for a neoclassical thinker like Alexander Pope to say, is that the forgetting is what you want. Because, of course, neoclassical art is all about memory. In fact, here, this poem is remembering some historical people. And so Pope deals with this in a complicated way by having Heloise in this poem. It doesn't happen in the letter, but in her poem, she imagines future lovers coming to where they're buried together. Of course, in real life, it was impossible for her to know that in the future they would be buried together, but they were. And so Pope kind of has her imagining that. And we see he has a complicated view of memory. So just because something is remembered doesn't mean it is always good or positive. And so we see here in line 243 to 52, may one kind grave unite each hapless name and graft my love immortal on thy fame. So she's like imagining that they are buried together. Then ages hence, when all my woes are o'er, when this rebellious heart shall beat no more, if ever two wandering lovers brings to Paraclete's white halls and silver springs, Paraclete is indeed where they're buried, or the pale marble shall they join their heads and drink the falling tears each other sheds, then sadly say, with mutual pity moved, oh, may we never loved as these have loved. And we have here this idea that some experiences are so powerful, even so powerfully good, that they just bring with them pain. And I think in this, aside from the beauty of the way that Heloise's thoughts are put together, this is from Heloise's perspective for sure. We see the letter begins with this, hey, you said you love me and you know that's not true. It starts with, you remember things differently than I remember things. And here we have her talking about her position and the way that he has all these different positions with regard to her, that at the end, that the memory itself is painful. And on the one hand, she wants the experience, but the memory itself is something that she doesn't want. And in the same way, I think we can read out of this an idea of neoclassical art, that just because something is fine art doesn't mean that it isn't full of sorrow and pain and deep emotion. Because for a neoclassical writer like Pope, the whole memory of art, the whole memory of human experiences, both good and bad, is part of the value of looking to the past.